It's hard to believe that we're already at 12 years. I think it was 2007 was the first year that David Crane, in a conversation with Greg Peterson, where is Greg? Greg's not here yet, but he certainly will be, developed this, and it's progressed over the years. And again, we couldn't be more pleased to have you all with us, and welcome. I would like to, of course, the International Humanitarian Dialogues, the theme this year is the justice we seek, the justice they want, cultural approaches to international justice. And you will see that we're focused very, very much on the victims this year. From many of our speakers to our panelists to our porch sessions. You'll see these are the topics that we will be discussing. I hope you've had a chance to see them in your programs. We're actually a few minutes ahead of schedule, which is great given our keynote speaker. Now, I actually had about a 3-page introduction for our speaker. And last night, Dolly Rapp said to me, "Oh, please don't." So, our keynote speaker is someone that we all know. There is not a more tireless worker, and believe me, I don't think he sleeps, and I've seen that in Sierra Leone. But there is not a more tireless worker for the cause of international justice and accountability than Stephen Rapp. And so please, I invite Stephen Rapp to the podium for our keynote address this morning.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jim, and it's so great to be here. I was a little concerned when you gave me 30 minutes for the address, and I said, well, that would be enough for a good start. But yeah, we've got a little extra time, but maybe we can use it for questions, or maybe we can catch up. Someone said the other day, you know, your speeches are getting shorter. And, you know, people give you advice, your wife, others, eventually. Eventually, you need to take these lessons up as you reach at least a certain age. It's just so great to be back with all of you for this 12th International Humanitarian Law Dialogues. I was here at the beginning, just then having become the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, just having had at least a soft start to the Charles Taylor case in The Hague on the 4th of June, 2007. And it's just been fantastic year after year. And as Jim has said, if I'm sleeping, I try to hide it, but I do spend a lot of time traveling, and every year I always, no matter where I had to be in late August, made a point to be here. And it's no different this year. I've got a flight this afternoon at 4:40 from Buffalo to Atlanta, and then Atlanta to Johannesburg, and then immediately on to Cape Town to join there two of our colleagues, Richard Goldstone and Hassan Jallow, who was originally invited to give this keynote address, and I'm very honored to be, in a sense, substituting for him. But the session we will be having in Cape Town, which is opening on Wednesday morning, is a conference on Africa and international criminal justice, and particularly the leadership role that South Africa has played. And it's being conducted in conjunction with several, we should have the foreign minister of South Africa as a participant, as well as members of the Judiciary or Constitutional Committee, at the same time that South Africa is considering the withdrawal from the ICC. The discussions I know that we've all had, we recall that Zuma withdrew from the ICC, former President Zuma, as a matter of presidential action. Some of our friends who deeply involved in international justice issues took the government to court and found that decision couldn't be made unilaterally by the president. It now falls to Parliament. The ANC has said that even though we've had a change in the presidency and a change in the cabinet, the ANC still supports withdrawal. And so legislation to enable that withdrawal is pending in the South African Parliament. On the other hand, the foreign minister recently said that she hoped that South Africa could remain married to the ICC. But the group that is conducting this forum is one that I'm very proud to be an informal advisor to, and it's the Africa Group on Justice and Accountability. And seeing Zainab last night, and I think most of you were there, but what a fantastic presentation she made. And we're so proud in the Africa Group that she recently joined, I think, as the 14th member of this group of senior leaders and jurists from Africa that include the African prosecutors amongst us, of course, Hassan Jallow and Richard Goldstone, others like Navi Pillay, who chaired the media trial when I was at the ICTR, and of course was president of the ICTR and later a judge of the ICC and High Commissioner for Human Rights. But it really is a group that works very hard to pursue justice in Africa from an African perspective, and to push back against the forces of impunity, against the sort of old boys, dictators, big men club that would basically say we can get away with anything, and how dare there be court proceedings on behalf of the victims in Africa to hold us to account. And as Jim said, this is a conference in which we're talking about victims, and listening to Zainab last night, even as she was at the highest levels of the United Nations as an Undersecretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and armed conflict, she was presenting and that perspective of the victims, of the people that are affected in these societies, and the way in which she would be able to demand her place in the presence of the Kabilas and others, and talk to them as one African to another about the absolute necessity of justice is, I think, the dynamic that we need to bring to bear in Africa and elsewhere. It's the one unanswerable argument. Where is there to be justice for the victims? It's not a matter of region. It's not a matter of north and south or east and west. It's a matter of those who suffer and the justice to which they're entitled, and an argument that those that would maintain impunity fundamentally cannot answer. Of course, what we are doing in South Africa is, at this time, very much a holding action, trying to keep a country that was a leader in establishing the International Criminal Court from leaving that court. And today, in a few minutes, we'll have our presentation of the prosecutors. And of course, as you will note, with the exception of Fabrizio here for the ICC, we're talking about courts that are in their last phases, like now in the mixed phase, with at least a retrial and appeals at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and perhaps some fugitives that can yet be brought in and tried at the ICTR and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, obviously in its residual phase, with our good friend Binta Mansouri, the registrar here, and with, of course, Brenda as the residual prosecutor, making sure that the legacy of that court is maintained, and that those perpetrators aren't returned prematurely and without an understanding of what they did wrong to the communities of Sierra Leone, and that the victims are protected. Extremely important work, but this is at the tail end of so many of these institutions. And what we had, at least for a period of time, is a situation when great powers supported those courts and their efforts, and mid-sized powers really did make their aid to countries conditional on their support for international justice and their full and complete cooperation with the orders of these courts that were entered under the United Nations Charter and under the agreements that established these courts. Today, the ICC has, of course, not many of those great powers as members of the court. And to be frank, we were talking this morning about the engagement of the court in the budget process and all the kind of micromanagement that states do when it comes to actually providing support or conditionality or sort of emphasis to other countries that you need to follow your obligations here. When it comes to doing more than participating in budgets and going the extra mile to establish justice, using your diplomacy in other ways, we don't have the kind of support, frankly, that we had for the ad hoc tribunals. You know, it's one of the great things about this Chautauqua gathering, and of course, given mortality, loss of even friends from the post-Cold War tribunals, the greatest thing about this for all of us that have been involved in it is the way in which we've been able to bridge between these institutions, and particularly bridge between what happened after World War II at Nuremberg and what happened after the end of the Cold War. And so thrilled that we had an opportunity over the course of these dialogues to get to know those that had participated in really the establishment of international criminal justice at Nuremberg. Remember those that participated who are no longer with us, Whitney Harris, podium prosecutor in the great IMT trial, personally the prosecutor of Kaltenbrunner, there at the interview with the commandant of Auschwitz, where the commandant boasted of killing 400,000 Jews from Hungary in just the summer months of 1944, and bringing that evidence to court. Henry King, who was involved in one of the subsequent cases, as was Bill Kaming. And of course, we still have, and I see him all the time because of his engagement with the Holocaust Museum, where I'm proud to be a distinguished fellow, and part of that involves working with him and his initiative. We still have Ben Ferencz, and we fortunately have also been able to engage with some of the others that perform supporting roles at Nuremberg. But I'm reminded when I think of those men, and think back across the 7 decades since those cases were concluded at Nuremberg, the challenges that all of them faced as global realities changed in the post-Nuremberg era. And I remember here, I think it might have been in the second year, talking at length to Henry King, and he described how coming back from Nuremberg, he had a challenging time with his career. And it was frankly because Senator Taft, if we may remember, just after the judgment at Nuremberg and before the sentences were executed, denounced the work of at Nuremberg. And I remember the first time I read about it was when I was young, and of course an admirer of John Kennedy. He'd written Profiles in Courage, and one of his Profiles in Courage was Robert Taft attacking Nuremberg. That was Profiles in Courage. I invite you to look at the chapter, because in the concluding words of it, Kennedy actually himself denounces what happened at Nuremberg is unfair to do to a former enemy in a war. And I'm reminded of the conference that Mike Scharf had at Cleveland a few years ago about Katyn Forest, and interesting questions about how that issue was handled at Nuremberg. But one of the speakers brought forward the film and the evidence of Robert Taft, or excuse me, not of Robert Taft, but of course reflecting to some extent the Taft view, but of Robert coming over from the Supreme Court and testifying in Congress in like 1952 to justify what had happened at Nuremberg in the McCarthy time period, and the idea of prosecuting cases against our German allies in partnership with at least in the initial trials, or the initial trial with the Russians, was not viewed favorably. So we had that period when, because of the conflict between East and West, the idea that in order to win that conflict, any tactic was okay, fair or foul, that you needed to pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe, in which standards and norms were violated on the Western side, and certainly abundantly on the Eastern side. I'm reminded in that yesterday in the film 500 years, which I hope many of you it was out, I think, in the papers. It's happening at 9 o'clock in the morning, so we didn't have quite the attendance. There were a lot of people there at 9, I understand, but we had nonetheless a crowd at 3 to see the film about Guatemala, 500 years. And of course, it goes back to Arbenz in the United States supporting the coup in 1953 that overthrew the democratically elected government and ushered in 50 years of horror and impunity which reached its greatest intensity during the genocide of 1981 and 1982 in the Ixchil Maya highlands that was the subject of the prosecution of the dictator at the time, Rios Montt, and a trial that I attended in Guatemala in 2013. But those kinds of crimes, there was no possibility of accountability. Certainly there were those that in the interim, our friend Ben, who continued to work and to struggle, and the academics who wrote and kept these precedents alive. But there was this long period when we didn't have justice. And then we had what I call the sort of second wave that occurred after the end of the Cold War, and when the Security Council wasn't blocked, but when nonetheless horrendous crimes broke out, 100,000 civilians at least killed in the former Yugoslavia, and then 800,000 in Rwanda. And the Security Council responded with unanimity, hearing, as Madeleine Albright said in her address on the passage of the ICTY resolution, we hear today in this chamber the echo of Nuremberg. And so, the crimes against humanity that were part of the Nuremberg indictment, really for the first time in history, become then a key part of the prosecution at these later tribunals. And the crime of genocide, not yet in existence at the time of, at least in legal definition, at the time of Nuremberg, created as a result of the facts that came forward in the trials of Nuremberg. And in all of the work that those of us who worked in the tribunals were engaged, those precedents, those legal rules were of such enormous value. I think in particular of the Charles Taylor case, when we were dealing with the question of aiding and abetting and the reliance on what had occurred in the subsequent cases at Nuremberg was essential. And if you read the appeal decision of the appeals chamber, which affirmed Charles Taylor's conviction, of course there was planning too in there, but a major part of it was aiding the RUF rebels and the FRC in the mass atrocities that were committed next door in Sierra Leone. The court relied on the case law of the subsequent proceedings in defining that crime. Now, however, as I said earlier, we see the closing of these tribunals, and we see a period in which human rights and international criminal justice faces again very strong headwinds. When great powers, including my own country in a great many situations, still hope there are situations where we'll come down right, but isn't in a leadership role. And other countries like Russia are in just solid and total opposition, and in which China essentially wants to argue that human rights, which was a universal concept, is essentially a Western concept, and their enforcement and observance is essentially an invasion of countries' in internal affairs. So we faced those challenges. A good friend of mine, Roy Goodman, received an award. I know Alberto Mora was there, and some others. I was in Iraq that week, earlier this month, at the ABA, at the International Law section. The Shattuck Award gave a great speech. I shared it with some of you about the challenges that are being faced in our world today and how the international humanitarian law, the specific law for protecting people in armed conflict, protecting those who are civilians who aren't engaged in the conflict, is being violated with impunity. And the absence of effective accountability in Syria, in South Sudan, in Myanmar, creates a situation where leaders can get away with it, and they know it. And the results of that are profound on our world. The 68.5 million people that are today in refuge. I mean, the latest report, I used to quote the 65.3, now it's 68.5 million people are either refugees or internally displaced people in the world. And they're not, contrary to some people's view, just escaping conflict, not conflict between soldiers that can create problems in the immediate battlefield area, but they're facing, in almost all of these situations, being the direct targets, being the soft targets, the people that are raped and murdered and driven from their homes, that are some burned alive before they can leave their homes. They're the direct targets, the humanitarian actors, attacked in ways that we thought we prohibited in the 1864 Geneva Conventions, norms that were actually generally observed even in World War II that are being violated. Why is it possible? Because the absence of the kind of consensus and support that we need to have a really effective internationalized mechanisms to hold these individuals to account. Difficult challenge as we sit here on the 27th of August in the year 2018. But you know, you've heard me say this before, I'm always an optimist. I can see a damp glass and say, this is half full. And it is not quite half full. But there are things that are happening. And the glass continues to fill, I think, in new and different ways. And I think that calls on us to look at the positive and what we see. One, we see today these norms having been established in difficult cases in the recent past, laws that, like much of the Geneva Conventions, which had been written in books, discussed by the ICRC in their consultations and private meetings with the parties that were allegedly violating these things, but actually then firmly established in law in cases particularly at the ICTY and in the context of non-international armed conflict at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We see the way in which crimes against humanity have been expanded and refined. I mean, in cases like the forced marriage case in which Zainab was an expert witness at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and it's now being followed up by our friend Nick Kumjan, who had an injury and couldn't be with us in the case in Cambodia, 2-2, on which we'll have judgment in November. The crimes against humanity, I see, is Leela here? Yeah, there you are, for heaven's sakes. Got to say it. Let's hear it for the convention. Thanks to our friend Leela's leadership for more than a decade, and Sean Murphy now on the International Law Commission, and now this year president of ACIL, this is finally taking off. And having an international convention, which to some extent may make it a little easier when people are dealing with things and saying, it's not a genocide, what is it? We'll have a convention and say it's crimes against humanity, which can, in many situations, include more victims and more severe suffering, not necessarily entirely on an ethnic or racial basis, but on a political or other kind of basis, than we have in genocide. And that's moving forward. So this legal establishment that's there, laws that are part of international custom and convention, and that form automatically the legal norms of countries in the civil law systems, in the monarch systems, and to a large extent are incorporated in the national laws of the rest of the world. This is an enormous step forward, and it really can't be taken away. Secondly, I think we've seen how national systems have stepped up to the plate. And I want to emphasize in particular what's happened in the third country area. And there was certainly a time when universal jurisdiction cases there was a pushback against. I don't see that now. I see the recognition of the fact that these crimes affect countries in Europe and elsewhere, that providing a safe haven to war criminals or being profoundly affected by the refugee flows, et cetera, that this is a solid justification, both on policy basis, but certainly there's legal basis for it, for third countries to be involved in prosecutions. We see the work of the European Union Network, which all 28 members of the EU, it's been there since 2003, are engaged. The United States, Canada, Switzerland, Norway are also a part of it. I think in particular of the work that our friend Alain, our cohort member of the Taylor team in Sierra Leone has done. I'll mention his essential partners in a moment, but as you may know, he's been dealing with these cases out of Liberia and presenting evidence to these units in a number of countries. And just this year, he's obtained 2 major convictions in Philadelphia, false statement cases to be sure, but because of the nature of those false statements and because of the number of those false statements, the judges have put in the kind of penalties, the kind of sentences that we would expect in crimes that were specifically prosecuted as violent crimes. But he had the Jungle Ajaba case, the head of Ulimo, real name Mohammed Jabate, committed horrible crimes, albeit on the other side of Charles Taylor, child soldiers, rape, murder, sexual slavery, lied about those things, convicted in Philadelphia by a U.S. jury, and the judge gave an unprecedented 30-year sentence, no parole in the federal system, 30-year sentence for those false statements. Less than a month ago, the Thomas Wareru case, the Minister of Defense of Liberia, when Taylor was up country in Banga, convicted for his role, for his lies about Operation Octopus, the attack on civilians at a time when Taylor was up country and couldn't get to Monrovia, and he wanted to say to the world, I'll kill anybody, I'll do anything, I'll spread out my tentacles and commit these crimes. He's convicted now of 22 lies, could face 110 years. We'll see if the judge does that. We're waiting on sentencing. Because of Alain's work down the Bailey in London, we have the case of Agnes Taylor coming on for trial. I met the team from SO15 the other day. I mean, this trial is scheduled to begin, I believe, in October for Agnes Taylor, Taylor's second wife, who organized the beginning of the attacks and the small boys units, small girls units, the kind of campaign of terror that became so emblematic of what Taylor did in Liberia and then spread to Sierra Leone. Third wife, of course, the vice president of Liberia today. Second wife facing trial at the Central Criminal Court in London. He's also, the Belgian prosecutors have been very active. They've got the case of Martina Johnson for her role as head of artillery for Charles Taylor in Operation Octopus. That'll be tried in Flamand, in Ghent, actually. So I guess I'll have to translate everything into Flemish. Then we've got another case coming on of Kasai, another Liberian warlord, in Bern, in Switzerland. But these are national cases that are being prosecuted and substantial sentences reached. So that's an extremely positive aspect. That's third country. Don't want to forget the home country. The way in Guatemala, it's been possible with international assistance like CSIG to try. We have the Rios Montt case was set aside, but we've had these other cases on corruption. We've had the Sapir Zakor cases involving sexual slavery on which convictions have been achieved. Zainab mentioned last night even the Congo, thinking about the work that has been done there in the military justice system. And just last month, the conviction of the Kavumu child rapes was upheld by the military court. It included the conviction, arrest, and imprisonment of members of parliament in South Kivu for the rapes of children in Kavumu, South Kivu, done in the national system, using the precedents, which are automatically part of Congolese law of the international tribunals. That's pretty important. The third thing is we have a greater intensity and higher standards when it comes to documenting these crimes real time. And we know how absolutely, those of us that prosecute the cases, and having prosecuted some of them and saying, we know these guys are guilty, where the heck is the evidence? And how are we going to connect We've got the crime base. We know that people are raped and murdered and amputated, but we don't, we have the challenge of that connection. And the intensity of the work that's been done, even in these situations where there's no possibility, at least in the near future, of having an internationalized court is incredible. I mean, we've seen it in Syria. And David's had his project. Others of us have been involved with Caesar and other groups in bringing the evidence forward. I'm proud to be chair of the advisory committee of CEJA, which now has 750,000 pages of Syrian regime documents, original documents. It's managed to basically OCR all of that, even in Arabic. It has now 2 million names in its database. Last year had requests from more than 500 law enforcement agencies, 500 requests from law enforcement agencies in a dozen countries. We've got what's happening multilaterally, not through the Security Council, but through the Human Rights Council, which it's tragic the United States is leaving, given the leadership that we exercise in getting a lot of these commissions of inquiry established. But this morning, if you woke up, you saw and looked at the papers, saw the news, the fact-finding mission on Myanmar has reported, indicating that given the character, gravity, and scale of the crimes against the Rohingya, the concentrated area at which it occurred, the situation that they were being forced into, which was barely habitable, that they believe that there are 6 named leaders of the military, the Tatmadaw of Myanmar, that should face trial for genocide, as well as crimes against humanity in that area and against other ethnic minorities in the north and east of Burma or Myanmar. But not just political statements, this is what should be done, supported increasingly with solid documentation. And we have these commissions of inquiry in a great many situations where you could never get action in the Security Council, whether we're talking about Yemen or Sri Lanka or North Korea. They continue to be created. Then we have, and I know our speaker tonight, and I'll miss her, but I've seen her speak in a number of other occasions, the creation of the IIM for Syria, which is working with these documentation programs to gather the material, to vet it, verify it, and work then even in a more direct way with prosecutors, but from a neutral, internationalized point of view, not necessarily from the point of view of documentation programs that may have support only from certain countries. But the creation of that mechanism for Syria is such a positive step forward. And then we've got a new mechanism, a challenging mandate, but one that is dealing with Iraq. An international investigative team headed by our friend Karim Khan that began its work last Monday. And I saw Karim 2 weeks before that as he arrived in Baghdad. So things are happening. And I should note, by the way, today, if you've looked closely at the report, we haven't read, the reporting, not the report on Myanmar, but they've called for the creation of an IIM for Myanmar as well, to see how to raise the resources and the support to get that done. But finally, I think it's important to emphasize that what we've got, and it's what this conference is all about. We have victims and survivors that are encouraged, enabled, and assisted in building cases for justice. And so much of the work that was developed by CEJA, the work that the IIM is doing with civil society through their Lausanne process, relies on the partnership of the people that are affected by these crimes. Working with them, of course, they're out there risking their lives. They want justice. They're finding information. They may not be finding it in ways that will be useful in a criminal justice process, but increasingly they're enabled to meet these standards and to work in ways that will truly open the door for justice. And when I talk about Alain's cases, those of us from places like the United States and Switzerland can perform an important role here. But Alain benefits so enormously from the work of Hassan Biladi back in Liberia, a journalist who was a witness in the Taylor trial, who'd been tortured by Taylor, developing these cases, identifying and bringing 15 strong witnesses in each of the trials in Philadelphia across the seas from Monrovia to Pennsylvania, and then back again to testify. And then working to make sure that what's happening in these third countries is effectively communicated, like through an outreach program. It's hard to ever emulate what Binta did at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but it really is essential that if we're going to do cases in third countries, that the victims be a partner in that process and that they know what's happening. And we're seeing that increasingly taking place, as we saw in the Habre case, which was internationalized, but was in the end of the day a third country case with a trial in Senegal for something that happened 2,000 kilometers away in Chad 25 years earlier. Happened because of the evidence, strong evidence that had been preserved, showing that Habre had been directly involved in ordering the torture and getting reports on it, and victims who didn't give up, and international lawyers, many of them experienced in these tribunals, who could help put it together. And some states, not all states, not necessarily great powers, and certainly no asking the Security Council whether Russia or China were okay with it, but that support then enabled a dictator who thought he would never face justice to be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to life, a sentence that was upheld just a year ago in Dakar. So there are positive elements. Each of them is based on the work that was done at Nuremberg, it was done at The Hague, it was done in Freetown, it was done in Arusha, it was done in Phnom Penh and elsewhere. It's work that's continuing in the ICC, which is a court that will be there. It's not going away. And is a capstone of the process, essential for the most serious cases, but a process that has to happen in more places than just the ICC. And because of what we built, it will. There are other ideas that are out there. I've been amazed recently at ideas that I thought weren't going to catch fire. The idea of joint investigative teams between states that could work together as a task force, something the EU has provision for that's been used for MH17. Those could perhaps be developed, and Catherine's organization could be a key part of it for investigations across Europe to make sure that countries prosecuted the most appropriate cases, that they had witnesses that crossed borders, that they really did develop a strategy. You do this one, you do that one later, we'll have him as a witness over here before you prosecute him in whatever country. You know, there are ways in which this can be done in a coordinated way. And I was recently at a forum on Myanmar, sponsored by the Friends Initiative in Paris, and I was amazed to see representatives in the UK and the United States both there saying, maybe we should consider a multi-state court, several states going together and pooling their jurisdiction to prosecute a court of internationalized character that, at least as I read the arrest warrant case in the ICJ, could even prosecute chiefs of state. We thought about that a little while in Syria, and there are several organizations and governments that knocked it down pretty quickly. But the demand for justice is there because the evidence is there, because the pressure is there, because the law is there. I think there really is hope that what began at Nuremberg and continued at these other institutions, and that we'll be talking about here these next 2 days and in future years, will continue, and that there will be justice for the worst crimes known to humankind. Thank you very much.